Today, we're going to be painting the Emperor's flaming sword. Yo dog, Kenny Boucher here. Next level painting, hitting you up on the literal best of all days on this Friday morning in the Beats Lab of Hollywood, California. We got another painting tutorial for you. Today we're painting the Emperor Light, Emperor Junior. We're actually just painting his sword. The Flaming Sword of Terror, I think is what it's called. I'm going to show you some simple techniques to making your sword look like the box art by GW, which is fantastic, by the way. The Triumvirate featuring Roboute Guilliman, Big Robbie G. Today we're going to be focusing on the airbrush and the paintbrush, aka analog airbrushing. Going to break it down. We're going to lay down the colors, get those transitions, and then we're going to pop some of those highlights out. It's going to be really easy, robust, but still concise studio tutorial. Speaking of tutorials, don't forget Twitch. It's the live tutorials. The Long War Network is live 7 days a week. We have convoys wall to wall, guys. Breaker. Check all the links in the description box below. We got giveaways. We got monthly gift bags, swag crates. We got the new templates coming out fresh. We got all sorts of goodies. Don't miss it. It's incentivized. Also, thelongwar.net is the home of the battle reports. Let me do a quick roll call and then let's start this bitch. I want to shout out a couple of clutch individuals. My man Kyle, Big Bad Booty Man, and Matt. Thanks guys, you came in clutch this week. Patreon is my personal crowdfunding page. It's how I keep the lights on. Thank you guys. All right, let's do this thing, guys. Let's pull out that airbrush flow improver and a little bit of Evil Sun's Scarlet. Here it is, guys, the Flaming Sword. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna apply several thin coats of this airbrush ready GW paint. Very thin over gray. Gray has pretty good stick with red. I've been using this technique for years. You've seen me do it a billion different ways. Pre-shades over black, workups over burn umber. We got them all, but right now, just thin coats. Emphasis on the very subtle, soft transitions. We don't want there to be any texture, or we're at least going to do our best to avoid it. So you can see here, we're building it up. You can still see some gray through. We're going to let it dry. We're going to do a second coat. Simple. There we go. Now we know every layer that you apply with the airbrush is going to re-intensify and add vibrancy to the previous layer. It's important to let them dry between coats. And sometimes, like what I'm doing here in the videos, I'm just blasting pure air on from the airbrush. And then when I feel like it's dry enough, send a little bit more paint down range. That easy. It's a pretty good technique. And most of the time we're going with 99% air anyway, so it's drying pretty fast. But I mean, you can do one step further. It's like the hair dryer technique, but with just my airbrush. Okay, now we're going to take Troll Slayer and the Evil Suns, and we're going to mix them together and create a nice orangey red. And this is when we're going to start sliding that transition toward the tip of the sword with the airbrush. Very light, very subtle. It's important to draw from the previous color when establishing a transition. That's kind of my style. So we used red and we added red to our orange, and then we'll use pure orange. That's basically my system for adding any type of transition. Thinning the paints properly with flow improver plus that theory is what keeps my transitions from showing any speckling or any weird dusty transitions. Now we're going to keep adding and feathering in that Troll Slayer orange till we get a nice clean coat. Like I said, important to let it dry between steps, because you see how vibrant it is here when it's wet. When it dries, it's going to mute down a little bit. So you're always going to need to take a second look at it to make sure it's exactly where you want it. There it is, dried down again. You see it muted, and we're adding a little bit more. Got to be patient. Now you can just blast this paint on if you wanted to, but you're in danger of building up texture and also the speckling that I'm talking about. I like to airbrush with flawless transitions. I like that illustrated quality. I don't like there to be any rough patches. So even when I come out with my paintbrush, I'm doing everything I can to mitigate any kind of texture, anything that, conflicts with the smoothness of my airbrush transition. All right, now we're going to add a little bit of flashget yellow to this Troll Slayer orange. Now that we've gone red, orange, now we're going yellow, orange. Same exact theory. It's nice and thin. It's very vibrant right now. Combination because it's wet, it hasn't dried and muted down, and also combination because light is really going to make yellow super vibrant on camera. It's kind of a thing. But you can see we're getting our now we're getting our flaming effects. No transition issues here. Nice and perfect. And see, I'm going pretty aggressive because I know it's going to mute down. And you can see right here how it is muting down toward the hilt of the sword. And we're just re-intensifying the yellow toward the tip. Adding more and more flashgets yellow to the mix. Slowly adding layers and getting it more and more vibrant. Now there's a couple, see, now we're going to use pure flashgets. And there's a couple more techniques I'll go over here in a second. So we're going to introduce flashgets yellow in its pure state, and you can see it's very yellow. But it will mute down a little bit, and it's also a little bit more yellow here because of lights and camera than it is in real life. But it's cool. And so a theory I like to talk about is that, so applying yellow over orange is always going to look different than orange over yellow. But ultimately you're doing the same thing, right? So that'll come up here later. Now we're going to take Snow White from Minotaur. It's a kind of an off-white, a little bit of an ivory. And we're going to introduce that to the tip. Very thin coat. And we actually put this white in the pot with a little bit of flashgets yellow still in the bottom of the reservoir. So like it drew a little bit of the yellow out. So we get a nice clean transition, get that white hot look. And it is, like I said, it's a little bit more vibrant than it actually is. See, as it mutes down, you can see it here. So now what you're seeing here is like, I didn't cover it, or maybe I'm covering it now. It's hard to tell. What I'm doing, okay, here it is. What I'm doing is I'm using that yellow and that orange that we used in the previous steps, and I'm glazing it over the mid-tone here. It's hard to see what I'm doing, but what I am doing is creating that reverse phenomenon. The orange looks different over the yellow. So what I did was I kind of yellowed it back up because it gets pastel. So now you can see down the shaft of the sword because we introduced a very thin glaze of orange. It actually made it more vibrant. Now what we're doing is we're adding black to red down toward the base of the sword, trying to create that nice flamey black-red color. There it is. Look at this best. And introducing a little bit of raven black. It's one of my favorite colors from Minotaur. I like some Minotaur paints. I don't like most of them though. But the white and the black are amazing. Okay, now this is where it's going to get interesting. We're going to pull out all those colors we've been using in the airbrush. Save them. Poured them in my ancient Chinese technique water bottle lids. And now we're going to pull out our paintbrush. And we're going to just start trimming in some highlights. That's just the flashgets yellow with a little white. And we're just tracing the edge of the sword by holding it in a certain angle and running the flat of the paintbrush across that ridge. That's the easiest type of edge highlight in the game, guys. Easy all day. You see how fast I'm moving, not really giving it a second thought here. Too easy. And this is a glaze. We're going on real thin with the paint, letting it dry, and then we're adding more as we need it. So it's kind of like the same thing as with the airbrush. It's important to glaze on your colors when you're relying heavily on the airbrush technique, because otherwise the texture will, in my opinion, clash with the smoothness of the airbrush. So I'm always being more subtle and always being more patient with my paintbrush game to combo. So that's a very watered down application right there. See that? Looks great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come in and start picking out the base of these flames that are hanging off the edge of the sword. Our intent here is to have them be brighter toward the blade side and transition into the darkness of flame, eventually all the way to black toward the outer edges. And this is very inspired by the box art. So I'm just kind of showing you how to recreate that box art. They tell you all the colors they use, but if you look at the sword, you can obviously tell they used other colors like that's not presented in that manifest. GW is in the habit of telling you 5-6 different paints to paint one sword and then still leaving something out. Right here, we're doing everything with what I showed you. So we're just flicking on some of these bright highlights toward the blade side, like I said, very glazed. Now we're carefully going to draw this center line with that glaze technique. Very light on pressure here and very thin on paint. Even though my line isn't perfectly straight, it's fine because it's such a thin glaze that as it dries and mutes out, it'll create a nice fuzz, a kind of nice inner glow. And then we can just come in with more applications and tighten it up. So now what we're doing is we have basically a palette on our thumb with our glove, with our orange, our red, our yellow, and our water on the table. and we're just jumping back and forth. We're pulling out orange when we need it. We're pulling out red when we need it. We're pulling out yellow when we need it. And we're coming on and glazing them real thin and moving really fast. But it's important not to overglaze before it dries. You get a few seconds to work with the glaze and maybe even mix another color into it, then let it dry, then come back to it. And they'll dry fast. It'll shock you how fast they'll dry. So it's, it's literally not just this one direction of glazing. I'm going back and forth. So now I'm re-intensifying that center line like I talked about. There it is, looking great. Adding a little bit more yellow and orange to it there at the base so it's not so ridiculous. Pretty easy stuff. See this right here? Now we're fuzzing it in with a little bit of orange in the mix. Totally fixing that line and getting that nice clean highlight all day. So let's talk about red. So now what we're doing is we're glazing on some of that Evil Sun Scarlet, whatever it's called. And we're glazing that red on toward the tips because the idea, like I said, is that they're hotter toward the blade edge. And as the flame gets cool and it then generates smoke, it gets redder and eventually black. That's the effect that we're going for. So just light glaze, establishing a nice red, and then we'll come back in with the orange like we did during the airbrush phase as a mid-tone. And that's what I'm saying. I'm jumping around my palette because I want there to be a nice blend. So now even we brought some pure yellow in. There we go. Tossing it down, creating that highlight. It's a back and forth process, but if you have all your colors laid out, you can go really fast. Too easy. So it's about building up to a pure red. We have a lot of orange in our red right now. And once that dries, we'll add a little bit of pure red to it. Keep generating that look that we're discussing. And then eventually we will pull black out. But right now we got to make it more red, more obviously red to the tips. Pretty easy effect once you understand it. And once everything dries, you can come back in there and start like popping out additional highlights, which we'll discuss here in a second. But here it is. Here's some pure red. So now we're going to be very careful. We're going to it's less of a glaze and more of just a paint because we want it to be very red toward the tip. There we go. And like I said, these are all colors we used during the airbrush process. So there's no new colors being introduced here. All the same. It's pretty standard operating procedure here at Next Level Painting. I can't even say enough good things about having the glove. I love using the glove as a mobile. I call it my mobile wet palette. Keep it icy. The only thing you gotta be careful about with the glove is that sometimes you forget the paint's wet on your finger and then you'll drag your finger across the model and fuck it up. So here we go. We're gonna pop out some of those highlights. We're using less glaze, more raw dog paint right here. And we're just popping out some of these licks of flame toward the blade edge to create that hotter effect. And this is a little white, a little off-white mixed in with a little of our flashgets yellow. Same colors we used before. Looking pretty good. Pop, pop, pop. And then you can bring this effect in to like anything you want. Like you can decide how much contrast. All you got to do when you're glazing, you just keep glazing if you want it brighter. And you can even glaze in the dark stuff. Glazing is a technique for doing anything you want. So we're re-intensifying the tip of the sword, creating that nice clean edge, adding a little pure white to it. Same deal on that center cross piece. That's the hardest part of any sword, is to trace along the center line there. You got to use very light brush work. You just got to be brave. That simple. Draw a nice clean white line. There we go. Get that nice definition. All day, every day. Now you can breathe, right? So now what we're trying to do here is figure out how we're going to drag in some of those blurs, like some of those cool effects that the GW box art used, where they had the flame extending down off the three-dimensional part of the design and into the flat of the blade. So what we're using here is flashgets yellow, very thin down for a super thin glaze. The trick to this effect is going to be not to rush it. To glaze it on incredibly thin 3 or 4 times. Re-intensifying it as you go, and you will see what I'm talking about here. If you've ever looked at the box art, you'll see they have these nice cool effects where now it looks like the flames are licking up the length of the blade. You can see here a little bit better what we've begun to establish. A fun new effect. Now you can jump around intensify highlights yet again. You can do something as something dries, and that's what's cool about glazing. You don't have to just sit there and wait for it to dry. Here we go. Now we're really starting to make that flame look hot. Give us some three-dimensionality to it. Look at its best. Cleaning up some of those edges. You can go as long as you want on something like this. I think I spent about an hour total on this blade. No lie. Is what it is. Between dry times, seal coats. Also had a mini disaster kind of in the middle. But here we are. We're just adding a couple more strokes. Cleaning up a couple of edges. Using a little bit of our glaze orange to, fix some of our super overly bright yellows. And look at that. I'm really feeling this blade. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit more red orange into those areas between the flame. Trying to create a little bit more contrast. You can always make the dark things darker and the bright things brighter. So that's what we're doing. Create a couple of darker lines to really bring out our flame. Too easy. That phenomenon, like I said. Make it brighter or make it darker. Or do both. Pretty easy. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about our transitions with all those thin applications. Now we're going to glaze on some black. This is still Raven black from the previous step. And we're going to glaze it on nice and light to establish a very subtle transition. And then we're going to intensify it toward the absolute tip of these flames. You can already see now it's completely changing the game. We're getting a very cool effect now. It's important to let this black dry. Once you get it to a place you like with this quick glaze. Looking good. Feeling it. And we're just using water for our glaze in case anyone's curious. We're just watering down our paints to beyond what you can possibly ever paint with. And there we go. Now we've added a few more glaze coats to the tips. And now we're getting that totally sweet flame effect. All day, every day. Let's talk about these dealies right here, whatever they're called. We're going to start by painting them black-red with our Raven Black, mixed in a little bit with our Evil Sun Scarlet. And then we're just going to start highlighting them with orange and then eventually yellow. And that's more of a placeholder because I want to frame out the sword for you guys to see how the base of the hilt looks. It's a little distracting with these things being the exact same color. But I do want them to have a flame color to them. But that's helping us really see what the blade looks like. Real quick, little orange dot. Drop a little bit in, very, very carefully, get a nice highlight going. And then just keep adding yellow to it. And you can make it as yellow as you want. Eventually I might make them pure yellow with cool highlights, I don't know. Still playing with it. But that's about all the similarities my model is going to have with the box art. We're using different blues, different golds. We're going crazy. I was just trying to simulate that flame on that sword because it is definitely one of the coolest looking swords GW has ever produced. Roboute Guilliman is definitely fresh. And we are painting him live on Twitch, guys. You're not going to want to miss that. Check it out in the VODs, check it out on Patreon, or just check all the links in the description box below this video for all of our rewards, all of our gift bags, and of course, all of our broadcast times on the Long War Network. Here it is, guys. Absolutely fresh. Do me a favor. Check all these little tiles you see on the screen and play on. Play as